beautiful souls. Welcome back to The Heart Code, where we dive deep into the transformations that shape us, challenge us, and ultimately set us free. If this is your first time here, I'm so glad you found us. This is a space where we talk about the real journey of becoming who we were always meant to be, especially in the second half of life when the rules change and society tries to tell us our story is over. But we know better, don't we? Today, we're going to talk about something that many of you have asked me to address. It's a topic that's both deeply personal and universally transformative. We're going to explore the 5 harsh truths about finding yourself after divorce when you're over 60. Now, I know that word, harsh, might make you hesitate, but here's what I've learned through years of working with women who've walked this path. The harsh truths are often the ones that set us free. They're the truths that stop us from wasting precious time on illusions and instead guide us toward authentic living. Before we go any further, if you find value in what we discussed today, please take a moment to like this video. Your likes help this message reach other women who need to hear it. Comment below and share your thoughts, your story, or even just a word of encouragement for someone else who might be struggling. Share this video with a friend who needs this conversation. Subscribe to The Heart Code and click that notification bell so you never miss our weekly deep dives into the psychology of transformation. And if you really want to support the work we do here, the research, the time, the energy we pour into creating content that truly serves you, consider supporting the channel with super thanks. Every bit of support allows us to continue creating these in-depth, meaningful conversations. Now, let's talk about what it really means to find yourself after divorce when you're over 60. This isn't going to be a superficial pep talk filled with platitudes about how everything happens for a reason or how you're going to be fine. You deserve more than that. You deserve the truth, and the truth is complex, challenging, and ultimately liberating. The first harsh truth we need to address is this: you are not starting over. You are starting from scratch in a world that has fundamentally changed since you first became an adult. And that world doesn't particularly care about your starting point. Let me explain what I mean. When you got married, whether that was 30 years ago, 40 years ago, or even 50 years ago, you entered into a partnership during a specific era with specific social contracts, specific expectations, and specific safety nets. The world you knew, the one where a woman's value was often tied to her role as a wife, where financial security came through marriage, where social standing was connected to coupled status. That world has shifted dramatically. Now you're stepping back into a landscape where the rules have changed, where technology has revolutionized how people connect, where economic realities are vastly different, and where your age places you in a demographic that society often renders invisible. This isn't about being pessimistic. This is about being clear-eyed. When you understand the reality of your situation, you can actually do something about it. The harsh truth here is that you cannot approach this new chapter with the same mindset, the same strategies, or the same expectations you had when you were younger. The tools that worked for you at 30 will not work at 65. The social dynamics have shifted. The economic landscape has transformed. Even your own body and mind work differently now than they did decades ago. I've worked with so many women who spend the first year or two after divorce waiting for life to return to some version of what they knew before. They're waiting to feel like themselves again, not realizing that the self they're waiting to feel like no longer exists. That woman, the one who got married, who built a life within the framework of that marriage, who made decisions based on being part of a couple, she served her purpose beautifully. But she cannot navigate this new territory. You need to become someone new, not better, not worse, but fundamentally different. This leads us to understand something crucial about identity. For decades, your identity was likely woven together with your partner's identity. You were part of a we. You made decisions as a we. You presented yourself to the world as a we. Your friends knew you as part of a we. Your family related to you as part of a we. Even your internal dialogue probably included we more often than I. When that partnership ends, especially one that lasted decades, you don't just lose a person. You lose an entire framework for understanding who you are. You lose the mirror that reflected back a version of yourself. You lose the daily routines, the shared jokes, the common history, the mutual understanding that comes from years of intimacy. You lose your role. And roles, as Carl Jung taught us, are powerful psychological structures. They give us a sense of place, purpose, and identity. The harsh truth is that you have to reconstruct your sense of self from the ground up. And you have to do it while dealing with grief, financial stress, possibly health challenges, and a society that often dismisses women over 60 as irrelevant. You have to do this while your brain is literally rewiring itself to understand this new reality. Neuroplasticity doesn't stop as we age, but it does slow down. Your brain can still change, still adapt, still learn, but it requires more conscious effort, more repetition, more patience. This reconstruction process is not quick, it's not linear, and it's not something you can rush through by reading self-help books or attending a few therapy sessions. This is deep psychological work that will take years, not months. And here's the part that many people don't want to tell you. You might not like who you discover you are. You might find aspects of yourself that were suppressed during your marriage, aspects that are uncomfortable, challenging, or socially unacceptable. You might discover anger you didn't know you were carrying. You might uncover dreams you abandoned so long ago that they feel foreign now. You might realize that some of your core beliefs about relationships, about women's roles, about your own worth, were conditioning rather than truth. The process of finding yourself after decades of being a we is archetypal. Jung would recognize this as a journey of individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who you truly are, separate from collective expectations and inherited patterns. But individuation in your 60s after divorce is particularly challenging because you're doing this work without some of the social and psychological supports that younger people have. You're doing it with less time, less energy, and often less financial security. Let's move to the second harsh truth. Nobody is coming to save you, and waiting for rescue will cost you the precious time you have left to build a meaningful life. This is perhaps the most difficult truth for women of our generation to accept. We were raised during a time when fairy tales and cultural narratives told us that a man, a relationship, a partnership was essential to our happiness and security. We internalized the message that being chosen by someone was the ultimate validation of our worth. We learned that our role was to support, to nurture, to facilitate someone else's journey, while our own remained secondary. Even in marriages that weren't explicitly traditional, many women of our generation made career sacrifices, deferred their dreams, and prioritized their partner's needs because that's what we were taught good women do. And many of us did this willingly, even joyfully, because we believed in the partnership. We believed that our investment would be honored, that our sacrifice would be recognized, that we were building something together that would last. When that partnership ends through divorce, especially when you're over 60, there's often a part of us that believes someone will acknowledge what we've lost, what we've given up, what we've sacrificed. There's a part of us that expects the universe or fate or God or even our ex-partner to somehow make things right. We wait for an apology that never comes. We wait for recognition that never arrives. We wait for someone to see our pain and step in to fix it. But here's the harsh truth. Nobody is coming. Not a new partner to make everything okay. Not your adult children to fill the void and provide constant companionship. Not your friends to structure your days and give you purpose. Not society to suddenly recognize your value and offer you opportunities. Not some magical internal shift that will happen on its own to make you feel whole again. The only person who can rebuild your life is you, and that rebuilding has to start from a place of brutal honesty about where you actually are, not where you wish you were or where you think you should be. I've sat with women who've spent 5 years after divorce in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the grief to end, waiting for their ex to realize what he's lost, waiting for a new relationship to materialize, waiting for their children to need them more, waiting for some external event to give them permission to move forward. And with each year of waiting, their world gets smaller, their confidence diminishes, their options narrow, their vitality fades. The mathematics of time become particularly harsh after 60. If you're 65 now, even with good health and longevity, you might have 15 to 25 really vital years left. Years where you have the energy, the health, and the cognitive capacity to truly live, to create, to explore, to build something meaningful. Every year you spend waiting is a year you don't get back. There's no rewind button. There's no second chance at this particular moment in your life. This harsh truth demands that you develop something that might feel uncomfortable at first. It demands that you develop agency, real agency, not the performative independence of doing things alone while secretly hoping someone will notice and rescue you, but genuine agency where you become the protagonist of your own story, where you make decisions based on what you want to create rather than what you want to avoid, where you take responsibility for your own happiness, your own growth, your own life. Developing agency after decades of partnership requires rewiring some fundamental patterns. It means making decisions without consulting anyone. It means sitting with the discomfort of not knowing if you're making the right choice. It means accepting that you will make mistakes, that you will waste time and money on things that don't work out, that you will experience failure and disappointment. And it means doing it anyway because the alternative, waiting for someone else to direct your life, is a betrayal of the time you have left. This brings us to the third harsh truth. Your loneliness is not a problem to be solved by finding another relationship. It's a portal to self-understanding that you've been avoiding most of your life. Loneliness after divorce, especially when you're over 60, can be excruciating. I'm not going to minimize this. The silence of coming home to an empty house, the absence of someone to share daily moments with, the holidays without a partner, the social events where you're suddenly single in a world of couples, the nights when fear or sadness overwhelms you, and there's no one in the next room who knows your history, who can comfort you just by being there. Our culture treats loneliness like a disease that needs to be cured as quickly as possible, preferably by finding a new relationship. Dating apps, social groups, remarriage. We're pushed toward coupling up again because society is deeply uncomfortable with solitary older women. We represent something threatening, something that challenges the narrative that women need partnership to be complete. But here's what I've learned from women who've truly transformed after divorce. The loneliness you feel is not just about missing your ex-partner or missing having a partner. It's about confronting the emptiness that was there all along, hidden beneath the busyness of partnership. The roles you played, the needs you met, the identity you maintained. For many women, marriage provided a buffer against existential questions. Who am I? What is my purpose? What do I value? What do I believe? What do I want? These questions got answered through the lens of partnership. I am a wife. My purpose is to support my family. I value what we value. I believe what makes sense for us. I want what serves our life together. When the partnership ends, these questions resurface with tremendous force, and the emptiness behind them becomes impossible to ignore. That emptiness is not pathological. It's not a sign that something is wrong with you. It's the space where your authentic self lives, waiting to be discovered. Jung talked about the encounter with the self, capital S, as both terrifying and necessary. The self is the totality of who you are, beyond the ego's narrow identification with roles and relationships. Meeting the self requires solitude. It requires silence. It requires sitting with discomfort. It requires facing the abyss of meaninglessness and finding your own meaning on the other side. Most people run from this encounter their entire lives. They stay busy, they stay connected, they stay distracted. They move from one relationship to another, one job to another, one project to another, always outrunning the silence that asks, who are you really? What do you really want? What really matters to you? Divorce after 60, especially after a long marriage, strips away many of the buffers we use to avoid these questions. And while that's painful, it's also a profound opportunity. An opportunity to actually meet yourself, perhaps for the first time. An opportunity to develop a relationship with yourself that's based on truth rather than performance. An opportunity to discover what you actually think, feel, want, and value. When there's no one else to please, no one else's needs to consider, no one else's judgment to fear. The harsh truth is that if you rush into a new relationship to escape loneliness, you will simply recreate the same patterns that led to the end of your marriage. You will build a new life around someone else's needs and desires. You will abandon yourself again, and you will lose this singular opportunity to individuation that divorce has handed you. I'm not saying you should never have another relationship. I'm saying that relationship should come from overflow, not from deficit. It should come after you've done the work of understanding who you are alone, what you want, what your non-negotiables are, what patterns you need to break. It should come from a place of wholeness rather than a place of desperate loneliness. Sitting with loneliness is brutal. I won't pretend otherwise. It will bring up every insecurity you have. It will trigger your attachment wounds. It will make you doubt your worth. It will tempt you with fantasies of reconciliation or rescue. But if you can stay with it, if you can let it teach you, it will transform you. You will discover that you can survive it. You will discover that underneath the loneliness is a person who is more interesting, more complex, more capable than you ever imagined. You will discover that solitude and loneliness are not the same thing. Solitude is a choice, a space you create for reflection and growth. Loneliness is a feeling, and like all feelings, it passes. The fourth harsh truth is this: the life you planned, the retirement you imagined, the old age you expected is gone. Grieving it is necessary, but at some point, you have to stop grieving what was supposed to be and start creating what can be. This truth hits particularly hard because by the time you're 60, you've spent decades building toward a vision of how life would unfold. You and your partner probably had plans, travel you would do together, grandchildren you would enjoy together, a home you would grow old in together, financial security you would share, a rhythm of life that would carry you through your final decades. Divorce shatters all of that, not just the relationship, but the entire architecture of your imagined future. And this loss is profound. It's a form of disenfranchised grief because society doesn't always recognize how devastating it is to lose not just what was, but what was supposed to be. Many women get stuck in this grief. They become defined by what they've lost. Every conversation circles back to the divorce, the betrayal, the unfairness, the destroyed dreams. They compare everything in their present life to what they had or what they expected to have. And in doing so, they make it impossible to be present to any new possibilities. Grief is healthy and necessary. You need to mourn the death of your marriage, the loss of your imagined future, the shattering of your expectations. You need to feel the anger, the sadness, the betrayal, the fear. You need to acknowledge what you've lost. But grief, like loneliness, is not meant to be a permanent residence. It's a process, a passage, a transition. At some point, and this timeline is different for everyone, you have to make a choice. Will you continue to define yourself by what you've lost? Or will you begin to define yourself by what you're creating? This choice is harder than it sounds, because creating a new vision for your life requires letting go of the old one. It requires accepting that the life you planned is not the life you're going to live. It requires releasing your attachment to how things were supposed to be and opening yourself to how things actually are. And it requires doing all of this while knowing that you have less time to build something new than you wish you had. Here's what makes this particularly challenging for women over 60. We live in a youth-obsessed culture that constantly sends the message that your best years are behind you. Everywhere you look, you see images and narratives that suggest that life is essentially over after 60, that you should be winding down, settling, accepting decline. These narratives make it psychologically difficult to invest in creating something new because part of you believes it's too late, that there's no point, that you're past your expiration date. But here's the truth that contradicts those narratives. You have more freedom now than you've had since you were a young adult. Your children are grown. You're no longer building a career or proving yourself professionally. You're no longer performing femininity to attract a mate or maintain a relationship. You're no longer molding yourself to fit someone else's expectations. This freedom is terrifying because it comes with responsibility. You have to decide what to do with it. Creating a meaningful life after 60, after divorce, requires imagination. It requires you to envision possibilities that don't conform to the standard script. It requires you to think beyond what society expects of older women and instead consider what you actually want. Not what you wanted at 30, not what you think you should want, but what genuinely calls to you now, in this moment, with the wisdom and experience and perspective you've gained through living. Maybe it's learning something entirely new. Maybe it's finally pursuing a creative passion you suppressed. Maybe it's traveling alone to places that fascinate you. Maybe it's building a community around a shared interest. Maybe it's starting a business or a project that serves something you care deeply about. Maybe it's simplifying your life radically and focusing on depth rather than breadth. Maybe it's dedicating yourself to a cause or a purpose that feels meaningful. Maybe it's creating a daily life that's small and quiet and deeply satisfying in ways that don't look impressive to anyone else. The point is not what you choose. The point is that you choose, that you actively create rather than passively wait, that you grieve what was and what was supposed to be, and then you build what can be. Not as a consolation prize, but as a legitimate, chosen life that has its own value, its own meaning, its own beauty. This brings us to the fifth and final harsh truth. The only way forward is through complete ownership of your past, including the ways you contributed to the marriage's failure, the choices you made that limited you, and the person you were that you no longer want to be. This is perhaps the harshest truth of all, because it asks you to do something that feels unfair. It asks you to take responsibility not just for your contribution to the divorce, which is hard enough, but for the entire trajectory of your life up to this point. All the choices you made, all the ways you compromised yourself, all the times you knew something was wrong and stayed silent, all the dreams you abandoned, all the boundaries you failed to set, all the red flags you ignored, all the ways you betrayed yourself in service of keeping the peace or maintaining the relationship. When you're over 60 and getting divorced, there's often a powerful narrative of victimhood that feels justified. You gave the best years of your life to this person. You sacrificed your career, your body, your dreams, your time. You were loyal. You were faithful. You showed up, and now, in the twilight of your life, you're being discarded, left to start over when you should be settling in. This narrative is not entirely wrong. There are often real ways in which you were undervalued, taken for granted, or betrayed. But if you remain stuck in victimhood, if you continue to see yourself primarily as someone who was wronged, you give away your power. You make your ex-partner the author of your story. You remain tethered to the past, endlessly rehearsing your grievances, building a case for your innocence, collecting evidence of your suffering. True freedom, the kind of freedom that allows you to actually build a new life, requires radical accountability, not self-blame, not shame, but honest acknowledgement of the full truth of your participation in your own life. This means looking at the difficult questions. Why did you stay in a marriage that wasn't fully satisfying? What were you getting from it that made you willing to accept what wasn't working? What parts of yourself did you suppress or deny to keep the relationship going? What did you pretend not to notice? What uncomfortable conversations did you avoid? What needs did you fail to articulate? What boundaries did you fail to enforce? What signs did you ignore? These questions are not about blame. They're about understanding the patterns that shaped your choices. They're about recognizing the psychological mechanisms, the fears, the beliefs, the conditioning that led you to participate in a dynamic that ultimately didn't serve you. Because until you understand these patterns, you will unconsciously recreate them. Most of us carry unconscious patterns from our families of origin, our early relationships, our cultural conditioning. These patterns shape what feels familiar, what feels safe, what feels like love, even when objectively it's not healthy. For women of our generation, these patterns often include self-sacrifice as proof of love, conflict avoidance as a virtue, pleasing others as a survival strategy, and making ourselves small to make others comfortable. If you don't bring these patterns into consciousness, if you don't examine them honestly, they will operate automatically in whatever new life you try to build. You will recreate the same dynamics with new people. You will make the same limiting choices. You will betray yourself in new ways that feel eerily familiar. Jung taught that what we don't bring to consciousness appears in our lives as fate. The patterns we refuse to examine control us. They show up repeatedly until we're finally willing to look at them, understand them, and make different choices. Taking ownership also means acknowledging who you were and how you want to be different. Maybe you were passive when you should have been assertive. Maybe you were controlling when you should have been flexible. Maybe you were critical when you should have been supportive. Maybe you were distant when you should have been present. Maybe you were dishonest when you should have been truthful. Maybe you were dependent when you should have been self-sufficient. These acknowledgments are painful. They challenge your self-image. They force you to see yourself with clarity rather than through the flattering lens of your own narrative. But they're also liberating because they restore your agency. If you contributed to the problems, that means you have the power to do things differently. If your choices helped create the life you lived, that means your choices can create a different life going forward. This process of taking ownership is not something you do once. It's ongoing. It requires regular self-examination, regular honesty, regular willingness to see yourself clearly. It requires therapy or deep personal work, or both. It requires reading, reflecting, journaling, talking with trusted others who will tell you the truth rather than just comfort you. It requires courage because it means giving up the protection of victimhood and stepping into the vulnerability of full responsibility. But here's what happens when you do this work. You become free. You stop needing your ex to acknowledge what he did wrong. You stop needing your children to take your side. You stop needing your friends to validate your version of events. You stop needing anyone else to change or apologize or recognize your pain. You become the author of your own story, and that story shifts from one of loss and betrayal to one of learning and growth and transformation. You begin to see your divorce not as the end of your life, but as a profound initiation. An initiation into authenticity, into self-knowledge, into the kind of freedom that only comes from complete ownership of who you are and who you want to become. Now, let me tie all of these harsh truths together, because they're not separate issues. They're interconnected aspects of the same fundamental transformation. Finding yourself after divorce when you're over 60 is not about recovering who you used to be. It's not about getting back to normal. It's not about replicating the life you had, or even the life you planned. It's about undergoing a complete psychological and spiritual transformation that allows you to become someone new. Someone who is more authentic, more conscious, more free, more alive than you've ever been. This transformation requires you to accept that you're starting from scratch in a changed world. It requires you to take full ownership of building your life with no expectation of rescue. It requires you to sit with loneliness until it transforms into solitude and self-knowledge. It requires you to grieve what was supposed to be and then create what can be. And it requires you to take complete responsibility for your past so that you can make different choices going forward. These truths are harsh because they demand so much of you at a time when you may feel you have little to give. They're harsh because they offer no shortcuts, no quick fixes, no easy answers. They're harsh because they ask you to do the hardest psychological work of your life. When you thought you'd be resting, when you thought the hard work was behind you. But here's what I know from working with women who've walked this path, who've faced these harsh truths and done the work they demand. On the other side of this transformation is a life that's more genuine, more satisfying, more deeply yours than anything you've experienced before. It's a life built on truth rather than compromise. It's a life shaped by your choices rather than someone else's needs. It's a life that may look nothing like what you planned, but that fits who you actually are in a way your old life never quite did. The women I know who've done this work, who've faced the harsh truths and transformed themselves, they have something that's rare and precious. They have presence. They have authenticity. They have a kind of freedom that's almost visible. They're not performing femininity or performing recovery or performing strength. They're just being who they are. And that being is powerful in a quiet, undeniable way. They've learned to enjoy their own company. They've created lives that reflect their values. They've set boundaries that protect their energy and their peace. They've let go of relationships and situations that don't serve them. They've pursued interests and passions that genuinely light them up. They've stopped caring quite so much what other people think. They've become comfortable with uncertainty. They've developed resilience that comes from surviving what they thought would destroy them. These women are not necessarily remarkable by conventional standards. They're not all wealthy or famous or partnered or celebrated, but they're remarkable in the way they inhabit their lives. They're remarkable in their refusal to be diminished by society's narratives about older women. They're remarkable in their commitment to truth over comfort, growth over stagnation, authenticity over approval. And here's the secret they all know. The secret that makes the harsh truths bearable. You have time. Not unlimited time, not as much. Time as you wish you had, but enough time to do this work, to undergo this transformation, to create a meaningful life. 15 years is enough time. 20 years is a gift. Even 10 years, if that's what you have, is enough to become who you were always meant to be. The question is not whether you have time. The question is whether you'll use the time you have to actually live, or whether you'll spend it waiting, grieving, resenting, playing small, playing safe, playing dead, while your heart is still beating. I want to talk about something else that doesn't get discussed enough in conversations about divorce after 60, the spiritual dimension of this transformation. I'm not talking about religion, though if faith is part of your life, it can certainly support you. I'm talking about the deeper existential questions that divorce forces you to confront. When your marriage ends after decades, especially when you're older, you're forced to reckon with mortality in a new way. You're forced to ask what your life has meant, what you want it to mean, how you want to use whatever time you have left. These are not comfortable questions. They don't have easy answers, but they're essential questions, and divorce gives you the opportunity to engage with them honestly. Many people spend their entire lives distracted from existential questions. They stay busy with career and family and social obligations. They construct an identity based on external achievements and relationships. They never really ask who they are beneath all the roles and accomplishments. They never really examine what gives their life meaning. They never really consider what they value at the deepest level. Divorce strips away many of the distractions. It dismantles the identity you built. It forces you to sit with the fundamental questions of existence. Who am I? What matters? What is my purpose? How do I want to live? What legacy do I want to leave? These questions can feel overwhelming, even terrifying. They open up an abyss of uncertainty, but they're also the gateway to a more conscious, more intentional, more meaningful life. When you engage with these questions honestly, when you let them guide your choices, you begin to live from a different place. Not from conditioning or obligation or fear, but from a deep inner knowing about what's true for you. This is what Jung meant by individuation. It's the process of becoming a conscious individual, separate from collective expectations and inherited patterns. It's the process of discovering and embodying your authentic self. And while individuation is a lifelong journey, there's something about the crisis of divorce after 60 that can accelerate it, that can strip away decades of accumulated personas and defenses and bring you face to face with your essential self. Let me also address something practical that intersects with all of these harsh truths: the economic reality of divorce after 60. For many women, especially those who prioritized family over career or who've been out of the workforce for decades, divorce brings significant financial stress. You may be facing retirement with far less security than you expected. You may be re-entering the job market in your 60s with outdated skills and facing age discrimination. You may be trying to stretch limited resources across expenses that were supposed to be shared. This financial stress compounds all the psychological challenges we've discussed. It's hard to sit with loneliness and do deep inner work when you're worried about keeping a roof over your head. It's hard to create a new vision for your life when your immediate focus has to be on survival. It's hard to take ownership of your past and transform yourself when your present is consumed with practical crises. I'm not going to minimize this or offer empty reassurance. The financial reality for many divorced women over 60 is genuinely difficult. But I will say this: the harsh truths still apply. Waiting for rescue, avoiding loneliness, refusing to grieve, and staying stuck in victimhood will not improve your financial situation. If anything, these patterns will make it worse because they keep you paralyzed and reactive rather than proactive and creative. Even within financial constraints, even with limited resources, you have choices. You can downsize radically and free up resources. You can acquire new skills and create income streams. You can build community and share resources. You can get creative about living arrangements. You can prioritize what matters most and eliminate what doesn't. You can find work that may not be your dream career, but that provides stability and even satisfaction. The point is not that money doesn't matter, or that you can just positive think your way out of financial stress. The point is that your agency, your creativity, your willingness to face reality and make hard choices, these things matter tremendously. And the work of transformation we've been discussing, the work of finding yourself, understanding your patterns, taking ownership, creating a new vision, this work actually enhances your ability to deal with practical challenges because it makes you more resourceful, more resilient, more able to see options and take action. I also want to address the role of community in this transformation. The harsh truths I've shared emphasize individual work, individual responsibility, individual transformation. And that's necessary and true. But it's also true that you cannot do this work in complete isolation. You need support, you need connection, you need people who understand what you're going through. The challenge is that your existing community may not be able to provide what you need. Your married friends may not understand. They may be uncomfortable with your single status. They may distance themselves, whether consciously or unconsciously. Your family may have opinions and agendas that don't serve your growth. Your old social circles may be tied to your former life in ways that make them painful or irrelevant now. Part of finding yourself after divorce involves finding your people, your tribe, the individuals who get it, who support your transformation, who celebrate your growth rather than trying to keep you small or comfortable. These people might not be who you expect. They might not be your oldest friends or your family members. They might be new connections, people you meet through new interests or new communities. Building new community after 60 takes effort. It requires putting yourself out there, which feels vulnerable when you're already raw from divorce. It requires showing up even when you don't feel like it. It requires being willing to be seen, to be honest about your struggles, to ask for help. But the women who successfully transform after divorce, they all have community. They have people who witness their journey, who remind them of their strength when they forget, who call them out when they're stuck in old patterns, who laugh with them and cry with them and just be with them. This community might be a therapy group or a book club or a hiking group or a volunteer organization or an online forum. It might be one deep friendship or several casual connections. The form doesn't matter as much as the function. You need people who see you as you are now, not as you were. You need people who support your becoming rather than trying to keep you frozen in place. You need people who understand that transformation is messy and non-linear, and that showing up is more important than having it all figured out. Let me talk about something else that's important: the role of the body in this transformation. We've been focusing on psychological and spiritual dimensions, but you cannot separate mind from body. Your body is carrying the stress of divorce. It's carrying decades of accumulated tension, suppressed emotions, adaptive patterns. Your body knows things your mind doesn't want to acknowledge. Many women discover physical symptoms after divorce: insomnia, digestive issues, chronic pain, fatigue, anxiety manifesting as physical sensations. These are not just inconveniences to be medicated away. They're messages from your body, asking for attention, asking for care, asking for release. Part of finding yourself includes developing a different relationship with your body. For many women of our generation, we've treated our bodies as objects to be controlled, modified, judged. We've ignored our body's needs in service of others. We've pushed through pain and exhaustion. We've disconnected from physical sensations that were too uncomfortable to feel. Transformation requires re-inhabiting your body. It requires listening to what your body is telling you. It requires movement that feels good rather than movement that's about controlling your appearance. It requires rest when you're tired. It requires pleasure, touch, comfort, It requires treating your body with respect and care rather than contempt or neglect. This is especially important because society tells older women that our bodies are shameful, that we should hide them, that they're no longer desirable or valuable. Reclaiming your body, accepting it as it is now, finding joy and strength and sensation in it, regardless of its age or appearance, this is a radical act. It's an act of resistance against a culture that wants you to disappear. It's an act of self-love that supports every other aspect of your transformation. I want to circle back to something I mentioned earlier but didn't fully explore: the concept of time and how we relate to it after 60. When you're younger, time feels abundant. You can waste years and still have plenty left. But after 60, especially after a divorce that you didn't plan for, time becomes precious in a way it never was before. This awareness of time can create anxiety. It can make you feel rushed, panicked, desperate to make something happen quickly before it's too late. But it can also create clarity. It can help you prioritize. It can strip away the non-essential and help you focus on what truly matters. The harsh truth is that you don't have time to waste on relationships that don't nourish you, on activities that don't engage you, on obligations that drain you, on resentments that keep you stuck, on fantasies that keep you from being present. You don't have time to perform a version of yourself that isn't real. You don't have time to play small or play safe or wait for permission. This doesn't mean you have to be constantly productive or constantly achieving. It means being intentional. It means making conscious choices about how you spend your energy and attention. It means saying no to what doesn't serve you so you can say yes to what does. It means living from a place of presence rather than distraction. There's a concept in psychology called mortality salience. When we're reminded of our death, of our limited time, we tend to either retreat into defensive patterns and conventional values, or we open up to more authentic living and deeper meaning. Divorce after 60 brings mortality salience whether we like it or not. The question is, which response will you choose? Will you contract into fear and conventionality, or will you expand into authenticity and meaning? Let me share something about pleasure because this is often overlooked in conversations about transformation after loss. There's an assumption that after divorce, especially difficult divorce, you should be serious, somber, focused on healing and growth. And yes, there's serious work to be done, but pleasure, joy, delight, these are not frivolous. They're essential. They're how you remember that life is worth living. They're how you reconnect with vitality. They're how you affirm your existence in the face of loss. Finding yourself after divorce includes discovering what brings you pleasure now. Not what used to bring you pleasure when you were married. Not what you think should bring you pleasure, but what actually delights you, excites you, makes you feel alive in your current life. This might be small things: the perfect cup of coffee in the morning, a favorite piece of music, a walk in nature, a conversation with a friend, a book that absorbs you, a creative project that engages you, the pleasure of your own company, the satisfaction of mastering something new, the simple joy of a day unfolding without obligation. Or it might be bigger things: travel to places you've always wanted to see, learning something you've always been curious about, creating art or music or writing, engaging in activism or service that feels meaningful, building something, whether that's a garden or a business or a community project. The point is to actively seek pleasure, to make space for it, to value it as much as you value productivity or healing or growth. Because pleasure is what makes transformation sustainable. It's what reminds you why you're doing all this hard work. It's what gives life texture and richness and meaning beyond just surviving. There's also something important about anger that we need to discuss. When you're over 60 and getting divorced, especially if the divorce wasn't your choice, or if it involved betrayal, you're going to feel anger, rage even. And society is deeply uncomfortable with angry older women. We're supposed to be gracious, accepting, beyond all that. We're supposed to forgive and move on. But anger is information. It tells you that your boundaries were violated, that you were treated unfairly, that something matters to you. Suppressing anger doesn't make it go away. It just turns it inward where it becomes depression, bitterness, resentment, or physical illness. Part of finding yourself includes acknowledging your anger, feeling it fully, and then deciding what to do with it. Not acting it out in destructive ways. Not letting it consume you or define you, but letting it move through you and inform you. Letting it motivate you to set better boundaries, to make different choices, to advocate for yourself in ways you didn't before. Anger, when it's processed consciously, can be transmuted into power. Not power over others, but power to create the life you want. Power to say no to what doesn't work. Power to insist on respect and reciprocity. Power to take up space and speak your truth. Many women I've worked with discover that their anger, once they allow themselves to feel it, is not just about the divorce. It's about decades of suppressing themselves, of making themselves small, of accommodating, of silencing their own needs and desires. The divorce becomes the catalyst that finally allows this anger to surface. And while it's uncomfortable and sometimes scary, it's also liberating. Now, I want to talk about something that might seem contradictory to everything I've said about independence and self-sufficiency, the importance of vulnerability and asking for help. Taking full responsibility for your life doesn't mean doing everything alone. It doesn't mean never needing anyone. It doesn't mean being invulnerable. Real strength includes the ability to be vulnerable, to admit when you're struggling, to ask for help when you need it. This is particularly challenging for women who've spent decades being the strong one, the caretaker, the one who holds everything together. Admitting that you need support can feel like weakness, like failure. But vulnerability is not weakness, it's courage. It's the willingness to be seen in your struggle rather than pretending you have it all together. It's the recognition that humans are not meant to do life completely alone, that we need each other, that interdependence is healthy. The key is asking for help from a place of agency rather than helplessness, knowing what you need and asking directly for it, being willing to receive support without collapsing into dependence, appreciating help without feeling you owe someone your entire self in return. This is different from waiting to be rescued. Asking for help is active. It's you taking responsibility for meeting your needs by mobilizing resources. Waiting to be rescued is passive. It's hoping someone will magically understand what you need and provide it without you having to ask. Learning to ask for help, to receive help, to be vulnerable in relationships without losing yourself. This is part of the transformation. It's part of finding the balance between independence and connection, between self-sufficiency and community, between taking care of yourself and letting others care for you. Let me address something else that often comes up. The question of forgiveness. There's tremendous pressure, especially in spiritual circles, to forgive your ex, to release resentment, to let go of bitterness. And while forgiveness can be liberating, it cannot be forced or rushed. And it certainly shouldn't be performed to make other people comfortable with your anger. Real forgiveness is not about excusing what was done. It's not about pretending the harm didn't happen. It's not about reconciling or trusting again. Real forgiveness is about releasing the hold that resentment has on you so you can move forward. It's about choosing your own peace over the satisfaction of holding onto grievances. But this process takes time. It requires first acknowledging the harm fully, feeling the anger and hurt, grieving the betrayal. You cannot skip these steps and jump straight to forgiveness. That's just spiritual bypassing, using the concept of forgiveness to avoid uncomfortable emotions. You may never fully forgive, and that's okay. What's important is that you don't let resentment consume your life, that you don't let your ex-partner continue to occupy all your mental and emotional space. You can put the resentment down without calling it forgiveness. You can choose to stop carrying it because it's too heavy, not because you've absolved the other person. The goal is not forgiveness for its own sake. The goal is freedom. Freedom from the past's hold on you. Freedom to be present to your life now. Freedom to create meaning going forward. Whether you achieve that freedom through forgiveness or simply through releasing resentment and moving on, either path is valid. I want to return to the theme of identity because it's so central to everything we've been discussing. Identity is not fixed. It's not something you have that then gets lost when circumstances change. Identity is something you're constantly constructing through your choices, your actions, your relationships, your self-narrative. During marriage, you constructed an identity as a wife, perhaps as a mother, as part of a couple, within certain roles and relationships. That identity felt stable because it was reinforced daily by your interactions and your context. When the marriage ends, that identity loses its scaffolding. The roles that defined you no longer apply in the same way. The relationships that reflected you back have changed. This is disorienting. It creates what psychologists call identity diffusion, a sense of not knowing who you are, of lacking coherence or continuity. And the temptation is to quickly construct a new identity to fill the void, to become the divorced woman, to become the victim, to become the fierce, independent woman, to become whatever new role seems available and acceptable. But finding yourself is not about adopting a new identity. It's about discovering who you are beneath all identities. It's about accessing a sense of self that doesn't depend on external roles or relationships. It's about developing what psychologists call identity achievement, which is a stable sense of self based on conscious examination of values, beliefs, and choices, rather than simply adopting what's expected. This process takes time. It involves trying on different possibilities and seeing what fits. It involves making mistakes and course correcting. It involves periods of not knowing, of being comfortable with uncertainty, of existing without a clear identity while you discover what's true. Many women rush this process because the uncertainty is too uncomfortable. They jump into a new relationship to quickly re-establish themselves as part of a couple. They take on new causes or projects to have an identity as an activist or creator. They double down on being a mother or grandmother to have that role define them. And while any of these choices might be authentic, they can also be escape routes from the uncomfortable work of discovering who you actually are when you're not performing a role. The invitation is to sit in the identity crisis, to be with the not knowing, to explore different aspects of yourself without committing to any of them as your new identity, to discover that you're more than any role, any relationship, any achievement, to find the self that exists prior to all the constructed identities you've worn throughout your life. This brings us to the concept of authenticity, which is often misunderstood. Authenticity doesn't mean expressing every thought and feeling without filter. It doesn't mean being constantly raw and unpolished. It doesn't mean rejecting all social conventions or norms. Authenticity means alignment between your inner truth and your outer expression. It means making choices that reflect your actual values, rather than performing choices that you think you should make. It means being honest with yourself about what you want, what you believe, what matters to you, and then acting from that truth rather than from conditioning or fear or the desire for approval. For women of our generation, achieving authenticity often means unlearning. Unlearning the imperative to please others. Unlearning the habit of making yourself small. Unlearning the fear of being too much or not enough. Unlearning the belief that your worth comes from being chosen by a man or being needed by your children. Unlearning the conviction that nice women don't get angry or assert themselves or prioritize their own needs. This unlearning is painful because these patterns are deeply ingrained. They've been reinforced for decades. They've kept you safe in certain ways, even if they've also limited you. Letting them go feels dangerous. It feels like losing yourself, when actually it's finding yourself. Authenticity after 60, after divorce, is a practice. Every day, in small ways, and sometimes in big ways, you choose truth over performance, substance over image, depth over surface. You choose what actually nourishes you over what looks good. You choose relationships that feel genuine over relationships that are merely obligatory. You choose activities that engage you over activities that are supposed to define successful retirement. And slowly, choice by choice, you become more yourself. Not the self you were groomed to be, not the self your marriage required you to be, but the self you were always meant to become, if all the layers of conditioning and compromise and fear were stripped away. Let me share something about hope, because we've been sitting with a lot of hard truths, and I don't want you to come away from this feeling hopeless. Hope is essential, but it has to be realistic hope, not wishful thinking. It has to be hope based on agency and possibility, rather than hope based on rescue and magic. The harsh truths I've shared are not meant to discourage you. They're meant to empower you by replacing false hope with real hope. False hope says someone will save you, that time will heal everything automatically, that if you just wait long enough, things will get better on their own. Real hope says you have the capacity to transform, that your choices matter, that there is meaningful life available to you if you're willing to do the work to create it. Real hope acknowledges how hard the journey is and says, you can do it anyway. Real hope looks at your limited time and says, it's enough. Real hope sits with your loneliness and says this too can teach you something valuable. Real hope grieves what was lost and says, you can still create something beautiful. Real hope takes full ownership of your past and says you can make different choices going forward. This kind of hope is not naive or easy. It's hard-won and clear-eyed, but it's also durable. It doesn't collapse when things get difficult because it was never based on things being easy. It doesn't disappear when you make mistakes because it was never based on being perfect. It doesn't require external validation because it comes from your own commitment to living fully in whatever time you have left. Before we close, I want to speak directly to something that might be true for some of you listening. Some of you might be in situations where the harsh truths I've shared feel impossible. Maybe you're dealing with serious health issues. Maybe your financial situation is genuinely dire. Maybe you're caring for aging parents or dealing with your own significant physical or cognitive decline. Maybe depression or trauma makes it hard to even imagine taking the kind of agency I've been discussing. If that's you, I want you to know that everything I've said still applies, but it applies with modifications. The principles remain the same. You are the author of your life. You have choices, transformation is possible, but the timeline and the scope might be different. The work might be smaller, slower, more modest, but it's still worth doing. Even if you can't create a whole new life, you can create a more authentic day. Even if you can't transform everything, you can transform something. Even if your choices are limited, you can still make choices. Even if your time is short or your energy is low, you can still use what you have intentionally rather than letting it slip away. The harsh truths are not all or nothing. They're not pass or fail. They're invitations to live as fully as your actual circumstances allow, without the denial that makes you think you're more limited than you are, and without the fantasy that makes you think you should be able to do more than is realistic. Meet yourself where you are. Start there. Do what you can. Be patient with yourself. Be compassionate with yourself. And know that even small movements toward authenticity, toward agency, toward truth, even those small movements matter. They accumulate. They shift things. They make a difference in the quality of your life, even if the external circumstances don't change dramatically. I've shared a lot today. 5 harsh truths about finding yourself after divorce when you're over 60. These truths ask a great deal of you. They ask you to face reality without flinching. They ask you to take responsibility without reservation. They ask you to do the hardest work of your life when you thought the hard work was behind you. But here's what I know. You're stronger than you think. You're more capable than you believe. You have more to give, more to become, more to create than you imagine. The years of your life have not been preparation for decline. They've been preparation for this moment when you finally have the freedom, the wisdom, the perspective to become who you truly are. Divorce at 60 is not the end of your story. It's a plot twist that opens up possibilities you couldn't see when you were locked into the old narrative. It's a doorway, and yes, walking through it is terrifying and painful and requires everything you have. But on the other side is a life that's more genuine, more satisfying, more deeply yours than anything you've known. The choice is yours. You can spend your remaining years mourning what was lost, waiting for rescue, avoiding the hard truths, staying small and safe and stuck. Or you can walk through that doorway. You can face the harsh truths. You can do the work. You can become who you were always meant to be. I believe in you. I believe in the resilience of women who've lived through decades of challenges and changes. I believe in your capacity to transform, to grow, to create meaning, even in the midst of loss. I believe that your story is far from over, and that the final chapters you're writing now have the potential to be your most authentic, most powerful, most beautiful. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for sitting with these harsh truths. Thank you for your courage in facing your life as it is, and your willingness to imagine it as it could be. If this video resonated with you, please like it. Your engagement helps this message reach other women who need to hear these truths. Comment below and share your thoughts, your story, your questions. Your voice matters, and this community is strengthened by your participation. Share this video with someone who needs this conversation. Subscribe to the Heart Code and turn on notifications so you never miss our deep explorations into the psychology of transformation and authentic living. And if you want to support the work we do here, the time and energy and research that goes into creating these comprehensive, meaningful conversations, please consider supporting the channel with super thanks. Every contribution allows us to keep creating content that serves your genuine growth and transformation. Remember, finding yourself after divorce is not a destination, it's a journey. A journey that will challenge you, change you, and ultimately free you. A journey that honors your past while refusing to be limited by it. A journey that acknowledges your pain while insisting on your power. A journey that says yes to life, to growth, to possibility, to you. You are not too old. It is not too late. You are not broken beyond repair. You are not defined by what was done to you or what you've lost. You are a woman in the process of becoming, and that becoming, messy and uncertain and difficult as it is the most important work you'll ever do. Take care of yourself. Be gentle with yourself, but also be fierce with yourself. Demand truth from yourself. Demand authenticity from yourself. Demand that you show up for your own life with courage and commitment and the willingness to do what's hard. Your life is not over. In many ways, it's just beginning. The most authentic, most conscious, most alive version of your life is available to you now if you're willing to walk through the fire of transformation to claim it. Until next time, keep doing the work, keep facing the truths, keep building the life that's authentically yours. And remember, you are not alone on this journey. We're all walking this path together, supporting each other, learning from each other, becoming who we were always meant to be. This is The Heart Code, where we explore the depths of human transformation with honesty, wisdom, and unwavering belief in your capacity to create a meaningful life, no matter where you're starting from or how many years you have ahead of you. Thank you for being part of this community. I'll see you in the next video.